Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation. I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet and to the point. I don't know about anybody else, but I was kind of curious to see what type of software I should use for the presentation itself. I know that some of you guys are using Panopto or however you pronounce that, and I wasn't sure how that worked. So I believe the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use OBS, which is a video game streaming software, and upload that to YouTube, and I will probably link my YouTube page um, to the submission page and where I need to put it in the discussion post. So overall, my topic is civil defense in libraries. More specifically, what I submitted to Professor Kurz was civil defense in libraries and how the program's ideology shifted during the Cold War. Uh, that time period, of course, lasted from the end of the 1940s following World War II all the way until 1989. I chose the format, as I discussed with Professor Kurz, to be an annotated bibliography because I felt for the format purposes that a full research paper with the course load that I have, that I'm sure a lot of you guys have, I'm taking 9 credit hours myself, um, mixed in with how I write my history papers or just write papers in general. I like to have a lot of time and not feel pressured to meet deadlines. Um, and the topic could get really out of hand. I could get really deep with it, and I felt that I would spend too much time doing something like that, so I decided against that. The other option of blogs didn't seem very appealing to me. I didn't think that I could really get into the information or you know have the purpose of the entire assignment, as I'm sure Kurz intends it, to really learn from something of the history of libraries through the blog post. So I chose annotated bibliographies because I'm comfortable with writing bibliographies in general, and with our kind of prep work with the bibliography work that we did prior to this assignment. Coming up with ideas and the book review and really reviewing the book. We're taking that critical analysis and applying that to this assignment. So I felt that an annotated bibliography would be best suited for this. So something I ran into the overarch for my project. I wanted to, definitely diversify resources with my prior training at Washburn University as a history major. I learned the value of having source materials from various years. So, this is dealing with the Cold War. So, ideally, I would have liked to have had information from, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, during the time period, and also from resources, 2015, 2010, that can kind of show a better reflection with time between the actual event and being able to think about how that affected history and looking back at it, while also being able to understand what the sources or what the research suggests over time. That's really the importance of separating the timeline, so to speak. Whenever I write a paper historically, it was good practice for me to come up with a timeline, as you see right here that I have here. Come up with a timeline, and basically the timeline for my project is my constraint. What I'm focusing on, what I'm keeping to. Professor Kurz and I has talked about keeping, the annotated bibliography format was to kind of keep it focused, keep it in line, and really not drag it out. And having a timeline that I set up for myself of basically 1948, I believe, is where my earliest information starts, to 1989 at the latest, really allowed me to focus the research on just this time period. Instead of worrying about the outliers, maybe, what was going on with Russia and the United States during, late World War II, 1945, 1944, because there definitely is source material out there that kind of discusses how libraries were preparing for, the end of World War II, and I wanted to avoid that. So, also where I found the sources and how I follow the trail. So I also kind of sat down with myself and actually a couple librarians that I work with, and I talked with them, and hey, I'm in this class and it's history of libraries, and it's history, but it's library school at the same time. Where should I start? And I really use JSTOR and a lot of historical databases or history databases for most of my research. at undergraduate level. And here we use databases like Lista, more library science databases. And so I was curious, and asking some of the librarians with experience, where do you think I should look? And admittedly, my expectation and most of my comfort came with JSTOR. And actually, so far in the early parts of my research, that's where I've got most of my sources. Um, I would like to, at this point, kind of show you where I started out. So as you can see, this is JSTOR. This is the main article that kind of, when you do the preliminary research, as it's called, to really decide, is this thesis statement or is this prompt really going to work for you? Are you going to be able to jump off and really get enough information out of what you're asking to research it? And this was a gold mine. This is where I started my research, and something I was taught at the undergraduate level, and it's kind of been repeated through library school, is when you come across a source material, even Professor Kurz notes it in his instructions for the annotated bibliographies on what you can use, bibliographies of other works of the research that you're looking at. You go through a source, a material, you evaluate it, you decide, does it have merit, does it really speak to what you're looking for, and is it really giving you a lot of information about the topic, concise information, things that you can use. This was a gold mine. This literally structured everything. It fit my timeline. It went over the entire timeline from the late 1940s up until the late 80s, and talked about the change over time. And I wrote in my annotated bibliography for this source, as I'll show you the example of it, that it was very well researched. And so I was able to go in through here, and this is the bibliography at the end. All these are sources. Every single one of these are sources. So follow the trail that's already been laid out. Follow the path. See, for the points that I really liked or points that I wanted to research, change over time, how each decade really changed from the last. So how different the 1950s were from the 1960s, I could pinpoint that, and I'll show you examples of that in my notes. But this is I led this path and looked at this, and I've been looking at other sources, reference pages or bibliographies, to keep following that trail. So moving on, ideologies over time. Now, the main proponent of my research is the amount of change that occurred within each decade. And usually these events changed back and forth over the entire Cold War time period, meaning, in the 1940s, we're wrapping up World War II, the global conflict. We're separating Germany into subsections of, who's going to govern which side, and the Cold War really warms up, the nuclear fallout from, the bombings and what that means to the entire world, nuclear war, the proponents of that. The 1950s with McCarthyism and the Red Scare in U.S. society and even libraries. And as my research has suggested, it was all about civil defense, fallout shelters, covering and ducking under your desk at school. And libraries provided all the information for this. They, made themselves into fallout shelters. They reinforced their walls. They made bomb shelters, created space or areas and basements for fallout purposes. They were all about reinforcing kind of that militaristic viewpoint of the U.S. government during the 1950s of, thinking that they had a chance should a nuclear war fall out. And that was kind of the fallacy of the argument that I've found, that, civil defense was great, and it was something that the libraries backed up. It was very popular. It really led to the center of information coming through libraries. But at the same time, the information was biased because, it supported the government's views on pro-military, pro-armament buildup, and that led to problems because, as you will find in the 60s, and the research suggests, the acronym MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction, became prominent. People realized that hiding behind curtains, as were suggested on pamphlets in libraries, under desks, behind couches, wasn't going to do a damn thing for you should a nuclear bomb fall. So that's how it changed over time. And into the 1970s, things kind of slightly shifted back into civil defense and militaristic viewpoints following, the rage of Vietnam. And, following Vietnam into the 1980s, even though the government was still very pro amping up armaments and amping up the battle with Russia and the arms race, libraries still stayed very peaceful, especially during the 1960s. They, aligned themselves with those peaceful protests and were against the war. So finally, some of the challenges that I've come across is keeping on track, and that's research in general. I talked about using my example of following the source material and what's relevant to my research, what I'm kind of trying to figure out and sticking to my topic, and is it staying true to this, or am I following shiny things, as I call them, things that are interesting but don't necessarily have any relevance to what I'm looking for. Um, Again, where I should have started, what databases to use. Should I stick with the library science side of, list of type databases, or should I go history side with, JSTOR? And I chose the history side. Because I was comfortable with historical databases, as well as JSTOR is one of my favorite databases. I like the way they're set up. And again, deciding the format initially was a bit of a challenge. I wanted to write a paper. I really did. That's my bread and butter. I did a thesis, 25, 30-page thesis before I could graduate. And it's a lot of research, it's a lot of work, but at the same time, it just wasn't something that I really felt I had the time to do properly. So I think that conducts my presentation.